This week I got to talk with Jakob Kerr about his new techno thriller, Dead Money. This book is the book that helped me realize that one of my new favorite subgenres is the techno thriller. So, if you've been hearing me talk about that, if you've been reading or watching more of that and you want some more of it, this is the book that you need. In her job as unofficial problem solver for Silicon Valley's most ruthless venture capitalists, Mackenzie Clyde's gotten used to playing for high stakes. Even if none of those tech bro millions she's so good at wrangling ever make it into her pockets. But this time, she's in way over her head, or so it seems. The lightning rod CEO of tech's hottest startup has just been murdered, leaving behind billions in dead money frozen in his will. As the company's chief investigator, Mackenzie's boss has a fortune on the line. And with the police treading water, it's up to Mackenzie to step up and resolve things fast. Mackenzie's a lawyer, not a detective, cracking this fiendishly clever killing with its list of suspects that reads like a who's who of Valley power players should be way out of her league, except that Mackenzie's used to being underestimated. In fact, she's counting on it because the way she sees it, this isn't an investigation, it's an opportunity, and she'll do anything it takes to seize it, anything at all. I burned through this book. It's over 400 pages and it felt like it was like a 250-page book. I was so glued to it. There's some really clever reveals at the end. I also really loved how Jacob's experience in Silicon Valley helped him kind of like weave all these little details about the tech industry into the story and really used the environment of Silicon Valley for a thriller because really it's a perfect environment for it. So I was so excited to talk to him. We get into when he had the idea for it, how it came together, how his experience informed it. So that being said, let's hear from Jakob. So I am so excited to talk about Dead Money, but I did want to get to know a little bit more about you here at the beginning. So what was the moment where you were like, I want to write a book, or when did you feel like you thought you were a writer?
I think, well, first, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think like many writers, my journey began with reading a lot.
Mm.
I was that kid who was always kind of camped out in the corner of the family vacation,
Yes.
avoiding my relatives, and like buried in a paperback.
Yes.
Um, I would even bring books to, family dinners out at restaurants and kind of like read surreptitiously under the table.
Me too.
Um, so yeah, I think probably many folks in your audience can relate to that.
Yeah.
Um, but younger than I probably should have been, I was reading a lot of thrillers and sort of twisty suspense stories. And, I started with Agatha Christie and Sherlock
Mm.
Holmes, and then went to the big sort of commercial names and plowed through all of Grisham and Stephen King and Michael Crichton, Thomas Harris, all that stuff. Um, and I remember reading And Then There Were None by Agatha
Mm.
Christie when I was young. Again, probably younger than I should have been. But just being really blown away by the structure of it and finishing it and realizing like, oh, I didn't know a book could feel like a puzzle that you were putting together at the same
Mm.
time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's when I first started to realize, I'd like to try this. And I always had this kind of thought somewhere deep inside that was, I want to try writing something like those books that I was first exposed to as, like a 12, 13-year old. Something that's, you know, twisty and fast paced, but it has enough heft to it that it stays with you after you've finished for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent most of my career sort of writing in other capacities, whether that was, journalism or law school, or my professional career, which has been mostly in communications. And then I think, like for many writers, the ideas just were rattling around in my head, and they got so noisy that after a while, you just have to shut them up and, and
Yeah.
get them out onto the page. And that was sort of my journey.
That's really cool. It is fun, like hearing about people who've read like their whole life, and then eventually becoming writers too, which some people just keep reading their whole life, which is cool too. But I resonate with that. There was a there was the movie theater that we used to grow up, or we used to go to when I was growing up, and it was like a really small one, like one theater room. Like it was really old school one, but the employees there knew me as the girl who would like bring a book and read until the previews were over. So I was doing that too.
Yeah, I worked at a very old school movie theater where I grew up in Seattle. That was like a second run theater.
Yeah.
And I probably saw the end of Gladiator like, I don't know, 300 times. So, from an early age, these stories were kind of just flooding my system.
Yeah. So once you started writing, what has your writing process been like? Do you know where you're headed? Do you just start writing and see what happens? How did it come together for you?
Yeah, the term that I've heard that I've come to appreciate is you have gardeners and then you have foragers, right? So you
Mm,
have like gardeners who lay out their entire plot of land and figure out what's going to go where, and then you have foragers who just kind of wander into the woods and see what they find, right?
yeah.
Um, I'm much more a gardener by nature, especially with the kind of story that Dead Money is, where there are a lot of twists and the plot has multiple layers to it. I really
Hmm.
needed to outline it in detail to make sure it all fit together. And that was a long, painful process, almost, to the point where when you begin writing, it feels like a bit of a relief in some ways.
Yeah.
That feeling goes away quickly. Let's be clear. But um, you know, I also wanted the twists in Dead Money to be ones that sort of you felt like they were there under your nose the whole time.
Yes.
Like layers within layers of story. And
Hmm.
I'm sure there are more talented writers than me who can wander into the forest and just find that sort of thing. But for me, I had to sort of plot it all out well in advance and,
Hmm.
really, really make sure I had my garden set up well.
Yeah. My caveat is I would say they're differently talented writers who can go
Yeah,
forage instead of garden. At
I
least I
appreciate
love
that.
that analogy. I've never heard that one. And I like that one's a little bit different than saying like plotters and pantsers, because it's kind of like the people I've talked to who it kind of comes to them, it probably is more like foraging. Like they're just like, I'll go see what's out there.
Yeah.
So I like that term, but I'm with you. I'm like working on a first book, and I'm
Yeah.
like, I had to know. I had to at least
Yeah.
know like my I read Save the Cat writes a novel. So like just at least knowing those beats helped me be like, oh, okay. I think I
Yep.
could see how I could do this.
Totally. No, for me, I'm the same way. I needed, the truth is that I think everybody ends up falling somewhere in between, right?
Yeah.
I didn't have every single pace point of Dead Money set out when I started. I think you do have to leave some room open for discovery, right?
Mhm.
And I'm sure most foragers, like they know where in the woods they want to start, right? And they kind of
Yeah.
have an instinct that they follow. So there's always a little bit of both.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, it's I need the sort of infrastructure in place so that I know where I'm going.
Yeah. Totally. Um, with the characters, did you do any work getting to know your characters before you wrote, or do you kind of get to know your characters as you're writing?
I kind of get to know them as I write. I think
Mm,
for me, the way that character works is, this is one of the lessons that I've had to learn. Is I start with some part of myself. So that can be a really big part. That can be sort of like a worldview, a philosophy, or it can be something really small, right? Just like an impulse I had one time or a feeling that I
mm,
occasionally get, right? And then I try to tap into it and build a character from there, right? So the seed is something from me, and then I sort of watch the tree grow from there as I go, right?
yeah.
Um, I think it's hard for me to. I need that initial seed for the character to feel authentic,
Hmm.
and I need that sort of starting point to grow from.
Hmm.
But then usually I like to just kind of see where the character goes, put them into certain tense situations, and imagine sort of how they would respond to them, and let their actions kind of drive their development as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. Um, so with this one, I know you worked in Silicon Valley at one point, so this is kind of a two-part question, but what
Sure.
was your inspiration for the book? And then how did working in Silicon Valley kind of like inform your inspiration?
Yeah. Um, I think in Dead Money, the main character, Mackenzie, she is similar to me in that her career is in tech, but she has never felt wholly of it, right?
Mm,
She's got this kind of insider outsider, sort of perspective.
yeah.
And I feel, I still work in tech, and I feel like I still maintain that perspective. I think I was extremely fortunate to spend a decade at Airbnb, just sort of accumulating observations. I was there when we were very, very small, like 50
Hmm.
people, and I stayed there for over a decade to when we were humongous. And, my general observation was that outside of probably outside of royalty, I don't think any group of people in human history has been treated better than the average tech employee. Like,
Yes.
my my wife my wife worked in a hospital. She works in healthcare, and we would exchange work stories at the end of the day, and it would always just reinforce how strange my workplace was, and sort of how detached from the everyday reality it was.
Hmm.
You know, like our office would shut down completely for 2 weeks every year for Burning Man. Like we had, a lot of the bells and whistles in the Journey offices and Dead Money are taken directly from my experience, like a ball pit and massage therapists and prosecco on tap, and there was like a full sized Airstream trailer that you could have meetings in. That was
Hmm.
inside, like it got craned into the office,
Wow.
and I realized I was accumulating all these observations over time, and I just
Hmm.
sort of realized, like, yeah, this is a good setting. It's sort of a larger than life setting for a story.
Hmm.
And then what happened was in the mid 2010s, you had these companies like WeWork and Uber and Theranos, where their founders were coming under a lot of scrutiny for their behavior, right? And that was
Hmm.
from, scrutiny from media, but also investors, from their own employees. And I recall thinking to myself one day, man, like some of these founders are so unpopular that if they got murdered in their office, there'd be like a million suspects, right? And then it was like a light bulb
Yeah.
went off, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And it kind of connected back to the mysteries that I had grown up reading.
Hmm.
And I realized, it would make this for this very nice juxtaposition, right? You have this very optimistic, sunny place full of big ideas, and everything's glass and bright cartoony logos, but you have
Yes.
this underbelly of ambition and greed and billions and billions of dollars at stake, and it just would make for this kind of very rich contrast. And that's sort of how the genesis of the story came about.
Yeah. That's cool. I like the idea that you were like gathering observations that then it was like unintentionally. I started this book 10 years ago, like a
Yeah, pretty
little bit.
much. I mean,
Yeah.
I wish I could say I had the foresight to like write these things down as they were
Yeah.
happening, but I certainly did not.
Yeah.
But it just kind of, yeah, I just was sort of osmosized into me over many, many years.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes sense. I feel like, especially like the first book you write, like, at least in my opinion, like you want it to be kind of writing what you know, because like then you kind of have some stuff to work with
Yes.
from the beginning.
Well,
So,
this was the first book. This is the first book I've had published. I wrote some other stuff that was, not, I mean, yeah, it's like I want people to understand this is not my first time, my first at bat at plate.
well, speaking of the beginning, the opening sentence I loved so much. So it says, in Mackenzie Clyde's experience, there are exactly two types or two ways of dealing with a rich asshole. And I feel like it just sets the tone so much for like what the whole story is going to be about, and it helps us kind of understand her really quickly. So did you play around with that sentence? Did it just come to you? How did that happen?
Well, first, thank you. It's really
Yeah.
nice to hear that. It came to me. I don't recall exactly when. It was pretty early on in the writing process, and when it came to me, I realized like, oh, like I was like, I like that.
Yeah.
And I just stuck with it, and I never changed it.
Yeah.
Because to your point, I wanted something that would very quickly sort of tell the reader who Mackenzie was, but also sort of set the tone of the overall story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and one of the things that I've learned the hard way during my writing experience is that if you want to write something that has a lot of twists and surprises in the plot, you can't start with those. You really
Mm.
have to still start with the characters and then build out from there and let the twists kind of come to you as you go.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it'll feel hollow. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that first line does end up kind of carrying a lot of meaning later in the story.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
that piece of it didn't actually come to me until later when I was deeper into the story and
Yeah.
was able to sort of connect back to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Um, and then the rest, I mean, I'm not going to read the whole first page, but it really does like go right into like what it's like to have to deal with these people with oversized egos all the time. And then her job is kind of like a fixer.
Yeah.
Which is in the synopsis. Like this isn't your typical HBO fixer.
Yeah. Don't call me a
Um,
fixer.
yeah. Did you know you kind of wanted to write with a character who was kind of a fixer within tech?
I didn't know about the fixer piece of it. I
Mm,
knew I wanted her to be an insider outsider, right?
yeah.
Somebody who was sort of immersed in the industry and knew it really well, knew it, forwards and backwards, but still felt like she was apart from it,
Mm-hmm.
and carried a lot of disdain for
Mm,
it.
yes.
Um, and there were earlier iterations of the story in my head where she wasn't necessarily a fixer. It took me some time to kind
Mm,
of come to the place where I was like, okay, I think that this is the role that makes sense for the perspective I want for her attitude.
mm-hmm.
And then, figuring out how that would play into the overall mechanics of the story. I really liked that. And it just kind of went from there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, One of the things I thought was really fun is you really included like all these like tech archetypes that we've kind of like come to know through media or whatever. So we have
Sure.
like the scorned startup partner, we have like really ambitious and stressed out founder, we have venture capitalists, the like hardcore coders who are like, I just
Yeah.
want to come in and code, I don't
Yeah.
care about money.
Leave me
We
alone.
have the tech bros who are like, my work is art.
Yeah.
And then we have like, you also still get like your tech girls who are like, gratitude and intentions and wellness retreats will save us all. So it
Yeah.
was like kind of everyone in there. Did you want to kind of include everyone, or were you just like writing what was and everyone kind of showed up?
I think it was more the latter.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, I didn't think about it super actively. I think it just sort of came out as a translation of my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think the truth is that for most of the 2010s, you could go to Dolores Park in San Francisco, which is this kind of famous gathering place on weekends where people just sort of hang out and drink and smoke and,
Mm-hmm.
just chill. Um, God, I sound ancient when I put it that way. That's okay though.
I want to
Yeah,
drink and smoke and chill.
I'm a couple of kids in, so I am ancient at this point. Yeah, my Dolores Park days are way behind me.
Yeah.
But I think you could go to Dolores Park any weekend in the 2010s, and you would probably meet all of those archetypes in the span of a
Mm-hmm.
couple hours. So it was mostly just a channeling of a lot of the different people that I encountered during my time in the industry, and different grabbing different pieces of different people and sort of amalgamating things together,
Mm-hmm.
and then also figuring out which sort of person would play the right role for what they need to do for the plot, right?
Yeah.
So you know If one character is the sort of scorned ex partner to the founder, like, does that make sense given the role that I wanted him to have in the story,
Mm,
right? And so on and so forth for the other characters too. So that was a piece of it as
yeah.
well.
Yeah. It was fun.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you.
you're welcome.
That's a
There's
deep well. There's keep reading my books, and you'll have plenty of archetypes to
oh,
to see.
I will keep reading them. What did we just watch? Oh, we watched Blade Runner 2049 here
Yeah.
recently. And then my husband was like Googling stuff because we'd read it. And he was like, is this that genre you've been liking lately? And it said tech noir. And I was like,
Yeah.
that actually kind of is what that is. And I'm just like loving that as a really specific subgenre lately.
Did you ever watch the show Devs? Devs?
No.
Okay.
But I remember hearing about it when I watched Halt and Catch Fire.
Yes, it's I really enjoyed it. It's kind of tech noir.
Nice.
It's not like as intensely sci-fi as Blade Runner, which I also loved. But
Yes.
yeah, check out Devs. Really good tech noir if you're
Yeah,
into that.
I'm going to. You've got me sold on that. There, so theme wise, there's also kind of this like conversation of how minorities navigate tech, but I mean technically also the world in general. But in this
Sure.
case, in tech, there are a couple quotes that really stood out to me.
Sure.
There's one, it says, because women are forced to choose whether to be honest with an ass like Tobias or swallow it in pursuit of the job, choose whether to take their maternity leave or fight for a promotion. And then there's another one where you reference like to effectuate change in modern corporate structures, we must first assert our position within them. If we want to change the composition of the table, then first we must take a seat at it. And I feel like it's that conversation of like, do you conform to the world that's unfairly against you so that maybe you can make it fair, or do you rebel against it? Like, what do you do? So was that like a theme that you wanted to explore when you started writing it?
Yeah. Well, first again, thank you. And I think you're right that there's like a tension there, right? And
Mm-hmm.
what I wanted to get at was, you just sort of outlined an interesting choice, right? Do you
Mm-hmm.
conform or do you rebel? And the reality is that in tech, like many other industries, you
Mm-hmm.
know, a lot of guys that look like me never have to make that choice, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And you know, I tried to channel some of the just frustration and rage that I heard from my very close women friends and colleagues over
Mm-hmm.
many years, because I think tech does have a lot of sort of long running uh, problems with creating equal opportunity for all sorts of people within it, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
not much different than a lot of other industries in that way, um, but it can sort of feel like a unique version of it in tech at times.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think the story contains a lot of broader arguments about capitalism and sort of the
Mm-hmm.
unfairness of our world, and it's a pretty cynical sort of viewpoint. And that comes straight from me. um,
Mm-hmm.
people ask me which character in the book is closest to me, and I always tell them it's Mackenzie's mom, Janine.
Oh
um,
yeah.
so like her perspective is very much my own. But in terms of the aspect of it that's specifically about how minorities and specifically women in tech can navigate this world, you know, I'm first off, there are plenty of brilliant women who have written more extensively about this topic, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely not the person who should necessarily be like carrying the flag on this. But I was working in tech when this book came out in 2013 called Lean In, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember how enraged it made many of the women I was friends with, because, there was the woman who wrote it. She was sort of arguably personally responsible for a product that, in my opinion, is the digital equivalent of double tar cigarettes. And she took this very thorny systemic issue and tried to kind of commodify it into like a
Mm-hmm.
self-help little buzz phrases. And
Yes.
a lot of people were infuriated by that. You know, I think Michelle Obama said that shit don't work. So about lean
There
in.
you go.
And so I remember, you know, even though I wasn't personally someone who was experiencing that rage myself,
Hmm.
I remember hearing it and wanting to channel it into some of the characters in the story and their
Hmm.
motivations, because I could feel that there was like a deep vein there.
Yeah. I'm not gonna give away spoilers, but there is even, I feel like there's even kind of a version of that book and that author in this book, a fictional version, and they also kind of have a conversation about it later on where you're like, oh yeah, about that. So I do feel that theme. It also plays out a little bit later too, because it's like it's hard to know which choices to make when you're like up against stuff, and typically there's not like an easy solution to it. So
For
yeah,
sure.
sometimes like you're saying, commodifying it or simplifying it is like that's not how it actually is. um so yeah, I liked how it played out.
Thank you.
um that Speaking of some humor though, there's a moment where like kind of like a slam against someone is like but he doesn't think that big, and
Oh,
the next sentence
yeah.
says like, in tech it was perhaps the worst thing you could say about somebody.
Yeah.
We actually, my husband and I work with a lot of people who love to be like, it's because you're not thinking big enough, and
Yeah.
kind of to that same conversation about privilege, like it's not always about thinking big enough. Like there are all kinds of other stuff. But I also felt like that tension was just like really great for thriller, like for a thriller.
Right.
That feeling of like you're not thinking big enough, so then everyone's in this frenzy to keep going for more. Was that something you kind of intentionally wanted to include?
Oh, for sure. And yeah, I think there's another line where it's something like, it's a lot easier to have this big picture perspective if you're up at the in the
Yes.
penthouse than if you're like battling for elbow room on the street, right? And
Yes. Hmm.
that's just something I sort of felt over my time in tech, definitely. Um, and I sort of felt like thrillers or sort of these type of stories sometimes follow the money, right? Because that's where the stakes are the highest, right? So
Hmm.
I think it's interesting. You could argue that like in the 80s, a lot of the best thrillers were set on Wall Street, right? Or in the sort of
Yeah.
financial world, because that's what was booming. That's where all the money was. It was super high stakes and cutthroat, right? And then
Hmm.
in the 90s, you had big law and these huge court cases and these torts and, John Grisham novels and all of, like, thousands of movies that were courtroom dramas that came out
Yeah.
in the 90s. And now the money is in tech. And for me, that's kind of where the stakes are the highest, right?
Hmm.
Um, you also have some unique factors within tech that I think made it good for a thriller story, in
Yes.
that you have these vast sums of money, you have billions, right, just sort of
Hmm.
swirling around in the industry, but you also have sort of people who are just 20 something and fall ass backwards into it, right? It
Hmm.
doesn't all have to be like a Wall Street trader who is the third of his generation, right? It can be the guy who sells a painting to Facebook for their headquarters and then ends up having stock that's worth like $20 million, right?
Yeah.
um, so there's a accessibility to it that I think
Hmm.
changes it too. And then everything just moves so fast in the digital age
Hmm.
now. Like things move so quickly that I think also helps with the pacing of a story like
Hmm.
this. So yeah, it was just all these factors kind of came together, and it
Hmm.
reinforced in my mind, this is a really good space in which to set a thriller story,
Hmm.
because it moves so fast. There's so many people trying to just sort of like get their way into it, and the stakes are super high because there's so much money involved.
Right. Yeah. There really is. And I couldn't figure out how to put a question together because I didn't want to give any spoilers
Sure.
away. But and I think you even reference it near the end. You might reference nesting dolls, but
Mhm.
the when you're saying tech changes so quickly, there are kind of like, what's cool in the book is you also, if you're not familiar with some of like the things that tech is already trying to do, or what they're working on, but that isn't available to the public. You kind of go through like stages of those things as she's like figuring out what's actually happening. So there's a lot of fun stuff that you learn through that process as well. But again, I don't want to give away anyone's motivations.
I
But
appreciate
I
that.
kind of liked that part too. Like you're saying, like things do change in tech so much. So then the mystery or the like what who was after what could also kind of be like changing all the time too.
For sure. And the pace of the innovation happens so quickly, and
Hmm.
the money flies around so fast that it's, it's like, today's low level programmer could be tomorrow's like founder, right?
Yeah.
And tomorrow's founder could be the day after's, washout, right?
Yeah.
Things
Hmm.
just move so quickly because the technology is moving so fast,
Hmm.
that that also increases everybody's like sense of urgency, right?
Yeah.
And paranoia that whatever you're working on is you're not moving fast enough to sort of
Hmm.
really like take advantage of it, or that other people are moving faster than you and they're gonna beat you to the
Yes.
punch.
Yeah. Yeah, that you definitely referenced that. And I was like, that is like the scary feeling because not like you can loosely copy an idea in general. And it's about which one really has like the luck of like opportunity, timing, like all of that stuff coming together. And
For
then
sure.
it becomes the rideshare app or whatever.
Totally. Yeah,
Um,
that happened
and
with
then,
Airbnb very early on, actually.
yeah, I
there
would
was
assume so.
there was a European group that basically copied Airbnb's platform and was like, yeah,
Hmm.
we're gonna do exactly what you're doing, but we're doing it in Europe and all these other places, and you can
Yeah.
either buy us out or you can try to beat us. And the Airbnb founders, I remember at the time being like, is this, can you do this? Like, this doesn't seem legal,
Right.
but it is. It's completely, it's just, a race to the finish. And so,
Hmm.
we Airbnb ended up moving incredibly fast to try to expand internationally, all super duper crazy speed, um, just
Right.
to protect their own idea, right?
Hmm.
So there's always an undercurrent of that in tech.
Hmm.
Just this idea that like the bottom could drop out at any moment. So
Yeah,
that also leads to really a nice tension for a thriller novel.
it really does. Um, Also, like all of that pressure lends to this quote from the book, where it says Tobias had one good idea years ago, and he wasn't even the first to have it. He was just the first person barbarous and narcissistic enough to manifest that idea into reality. And so my husband and I kind of sometimes joke like it would be easier to be in business together if we were sociopaths. Like
Yeah.
it would just be easier to be successful if you weren't empathetic and you're kind of sociopathic, or in this case, even just like narcissistic enough that you're like, I am going to be the one who makes this work.
Yeah.
So were those big egos kind of like attractive to include in something like a thriller too?
Oh, for sure. And yeah, absolutely. And I think your point is right on. Our system does not incentivize being nice or kind or empathetic, right? It incentivizes the kind of, behavior that a lot of the sort of people on the top of the tech industry um, are, the ways that they behave. I think your camera froze again. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, no worries. So yeah, I think one of the themes that I wanted to emphasize in the story too was that the tech industry really isn't so different from Wall Street or any other big ruthless American industry, right? Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
tech is just smarter about how it packages itself, right?
Mm,
Um, on Wall Street, I think a lot of the ruthlessness is pretty brazen. It's just for the sake of money, and everyone's open about that. And tech, I
mm-hmm.
think there's this veneer sometimes of it's for something bigger than just money. It's about progress and a
Mm,
greater vision and the future and a mission. Um, but I don't think it ends up operating in practice any different than most other American industries.
right.
And I wasn't I think if anybody wants to sort of read a takedown of the tech industry or a treatise on its many problems, there are tons of nonfiction books out there by many really talented writers.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted that to be sort of an undercurrent of the story or a perspective that some of the characters had, but wanted to make sure it was entertaining first and foremost. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I do agree. It's, the way I view it sometimes is like people talk about our sort of capitalist business landscape as though it's like a jungle, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
I think the tech industry, some of its products and its services that it's innovated have been so powerful and so revolutionary that tech really did have the potential to change some of the
Mm-hmm.
worst aspects of how that system works, but it hasn't.
Yeah.
Instead of making the jungle a gentler place, it's just become the apex predator instead, right?
Yeah.
And I wanted that theme to come through in the story. And
Mm-hmm.
when you do have, I think a lot of the main character Mackenzie, her conversations with her mother really like touch on this topic, right?
Yeah.
If you have the system that is unfair, and you can see the ways in which it's sort of ruthless and broken,
Mm-hmm.
how do you respond to that? um,
Yeah.
you have many different choices, and I think the characters in the story kind of make their own choices and see what the consequences are.
Yeah. And they definitely do. Um, we can't really talk about the ending, but did you know while you were writing that that's where you were headed?
you know it's it's hard to say.
Uh-huh.
I don't It definitely came to me at some point during like the plotting
Okay.
process.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of the writing experience for Dead Money was sort of like an out of body experience because I
Oh,
wrote it when we had two children that were both under the age of two.
wow.
So like I was writing between diaper changes and nap times and sort of this weird fugue state
Yeah.
while I was writing it. But it definitely a lot of the sort of layered structure of the plot came to me when I was sort of doing the initial gardening, right?
Mm,
Um, but I will say I know for certain that it wasn't the first thing that came to me. It came to me.
yeah.
So I started with the characters, started
Mhm.
with some initial ideas of like how I wanted the mystery to play out, and then I tweaked it and changed it as it seemed to feel right for the characters I
Mm,
had created.
yeah. Well, that makes sense. If you can't tell, I loved reading it. So
Thank you so
everybody,
much.
everybody who loves tech is slightly interested in tech and loves thrillers, will definitely love this one too.
Yeah. Even if you hate
Um,
tech, you might like certain aspects of it.
that's a good point.
Could
That's a
be a
good
little
point.
can be a
Yeah.
little cathartic.
Yeah, it is like satirical. So if you also if you like satire on tech, we'll amend it to say that.
Sure.
But it sounds like you are a big reader too. So I have been asking people at the end if they've read anything recently that they loved.
Yes, I have. It is completely and utterly like it is so polar opposite from Dead Money that it's
That's okay.
a strange recommendation. But for the first time, I read Lonesome Dove
Okay.
like a few weeks ago, about 180 degrees different from Dead Money.
Yeah.
Like a classic like Western novel. And
Hmm.
it took me a little while to get into it, but once I got going, it's now become one of my favorite books ever. So
I love when
um,
that
yeah,
happens.
I like. I'm weird with my genres. I just sort of like
Hmm.
bop around from different spot to different spot. So
That's
yeah,
cool.
yeah,
I wish, sometimes I still wish. I mean, I say it like I don't have 1,000 books on my TBR, but sometimes I'm like, man, why don't I get into this genre? Which I read quite a bit of the subgenres in thrillers, I
yeah,
guess, because I used to be like, oh, I'm not a mood reader. I only read thrillers. And then I
yeah.
was like, oh, no, they're like different ones that I end up reading. But you might have convinced me. Maybe I need to read Lonesome Dove now, too.
Have you ever read the Longmire novels?
Mm-mm.
They're about a sheriff. They're mysteries about a sheriff in a small town in Wyoming, and
Mm-hmm.
they're you know I've really enjoyed them. It's like characters that you want to hang out with, and it
Nice.
just has like a really cool vibe to it. it's much different than Dead Money. They're not as kind of rapid or twisty, but they're really atmospheric, and
Yeah,
the characters are great. I believe it's Craig Johnson is his name, is the author.
that's what it
So
looks like. Yep.
yeah, the Longmire series. The first book is called The Cold Dish, and those are
Hmm.
really great as well. Um,
Nice.
and then
Oh yeah,
yeah,
these I thought I this was it was made into a TV show with A&E.
I think it has
I
been.
thought
Yeah,
that's what I thought I remembered the name associated with the TV show
yeah,
too. That's cool.
yeah. Um, One other recommendation, I imagine you've read Blake Crouch.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Recursion. I think yeah, like Dark Matter was made into the TV show recently, and it was,
Yes.
rightly so, like super popular.
Hmm.
Um, but I believe it's called Recursion. Let me make sure I have the name.
Yeah, it's the
Yeah,
yellow one.
yes, the yellow one. For my money, that one was even better. I mean, they're both great, but like
Fantastic.
Recursion is an awesome story, and highly recommend that too.
Yeah. I loved that one. It plays with a like memory and
Totally.
I mean you could argue it does play with time. I guess that's what
Sure.
I'll say.
Yep.
And it is so mind bendy. And
Yeah.
I've just been on a mind bending kick lately. So
I
I'm seconding you on that one.
I cannot imagine what his plot outline looked like for Recursion, and
Right.
I'm just like very much in awe of it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I would check that one out too if you haven't.
Yeah, that one was great. Upgrade was the same way where I was
Yeah,
like, he had so many things at play going on. Yeah,
yeah,
I love his books a lot.
me too.
Well, where can people follow you to stay up to date with everything?
Yeah, people can follow my website is just www.jakobkerr.com,
Mhm.
JAKOBKERR. I have a newsletter on there. I'm also on Instagram, Jakob_Kerr. It's just strictly book stuff on there,
Mhm.
all things Dead Money. And yeah, it comes out January 28th. And thank you again for having me. It's been really great chatting.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to put all of that in the show notes for people.
Awesome.
And then hopefully you can come back and talk about another tech noir.
That would be awesome. Let's knock on wood.